With 2025 officially over and we're entering the first week of 2026, I thought it would be interesting to talk about the best games of the 2020s so far. As we enter halfway through the decade, there have been a lot of really great years. As a matter of fact, I would say that for the most part, the last 5 years have been nothing but great for us in terms of what we've been getting. There have been some off years, of course, and we'll talk about that in which years I think were misses. But for the most part, every year has delivered for most people. Even 2025, 2024, there have been a ton of games that come from pretty much every genre that could sit for everybody, depending on what you'd like. There have been some disappointments, but really, for the most part, the 2020s have been excellent for gaming, at least in terms of actual new games. Of course, hardware is a completely different story, but for the most part, in terms of actual games, it has been a great decade. So I wanted to make this little list here because I've actually changed my mind on a lot of games from the last 5 or so years that I thought were going to be my game of the years. And in comparison to the actual nominated game of the years, there's going to be a few differences here and there, and we'll talk about those as we get to them. That all being said, without further ado, let's go into the first year on our list, 2020. Now, 2020 had a lot of games that were pushed, but also games that came out on time. In fact, I would say that for the most part in that year, we got a lot of those games within the middle of the year, between April and August. I would say a lot of the games I'm going to be talking about released around that frame because, well, they were planned for those dates. And luckily, they came out when they did because they salvaged a year that desperately needed to be salvaged. Unfortunately, because of this, though, many games that were planned for 2021 were pushed into later years. So we'll be talking about 2021 when we get to it, but focusing solely on 2020, it was a solid lineup, and it was pretty divisive, very divisive online on what was actually going to be Game of the Year. Personally, for me, this came down to two games, and one of which I covered recently, a game that I only recently played this year. I think I'm going to have to go with Final Fantasy VII Remake. This was a very close tie with Ghost of Tsushima, and really it could have gone either way had I not chosen to complete Final Fantasy VII Remake this year, as I've gone back and forth on actually playing it until this year. So now that I've beaten it in 2025, I can retroactively say that my game of the year for 2020 would have been Final Fantasy VII Remake. It just addresses so much about what I love in games, having a great story, great characters, and excellent gameplay. It did everything for me, and I wasn't even an RPG guy back then. But now that I'm looking back, with all the benefit of hindsight, the benefit of just completing it, and of course the fact that I'm currently in an open world fatigue, which unfortunately Ghost of Yotei only made worse, that being the sequel to Ghost of Tsushima, kind of jaded me the wrong way. We're currently in a situation now where I just kind of have to pick Final Fantasy VII by default, and in addition to all of its good qualities, it was one of the few games that really got my attention that year, and why I think it absolutely deserved to be Game of the Year. Like I said though, this was a pretty close one, and I can totally understand if you put Ghost of Tsushima over Final Fantasy VII Remake, but those were my big two really. Those were the two that got my attention for most of the year, along with Spider-Man Miles Morales. However, I did not get the chance to play that until 2021, so I feel like it wasn't really fair to include it in this case because of course it released very late in the year, and the experience was better on PS5, which, if you remember 2020, the PS5 was not available for a majority of the year, so I'm not really going to include it, and even if I was, I don't think it would be Game of the Year material, not even by a long shot. One more mention I do want to talk about is The Last of Us 2. Now, for those old ones out there in my comment section, you might remember that I did make a video talking about The Last of Us 2 and why I thought it was a failure, narratively and gameplay-wise. And I still stand by that, as narratively, I think The Last of Us has to stand on that, as its gameplay is nothing really all that special. So when a narrative fails in a sequel, you kind of have to realize that the game itself fails. It doesn't lend itself any favors. And this is before the roguelike mode came out in, I believe, 2024. So you would have to take the base game, you have a worse story, you take off all of our favorite characters, and you ultimately get a worse game. And truly, I don't see why it won Game of the Year that year. I honestly think Ghost of Tsushima could have won. I would have given it to Final Fantasy VII Remake. So those are my thoughts on the actual Game of the Year, though I know this is very divisive, so I'm just going to leave it at that. But I did release that video, and I know a lot of people were not very happy. But, you know, it is all opinions here. We can all have different opinions. If you think it deserved Game of the Year, I'm happy for you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. But me personally, I detest it, and I think it's one of the worst sequels in gaming history. With 2020 out of the way, we can now move into 2021. And this is a bit of an oddity because, of course, 2021 to me, and I think to a lot of people as well, was kind of a filler year in terms of games. A lot of the stuff we were expecting got pushed either into 2022 or even later than that. So 2021 was a bit of an open slot, which was good for some games, like what I'm about to mention. But also, it did feel like all of any game that I wanted to play was very few and far between. And really, it was uncontested for my personal game of the year, Resident Evil Village. Village to me represents a lot of what I love about the modern Resident Evil games, as it has enough action to keep you entertained while simultaneously still having characters that are just so interesting to listen to. And while the motivations are definitely questionable in this game, and that's why a lot of people were upset with how Chris was treated, I still like the game overall. I still have so much fun going back and playing it. In fact, I almost have this game 100% just because of how much I love it. And I never really go for that in Resident Evil, especially because of the hardest difficulty, but this game rewards you for playing, and really it gives you a lot to upgrade and keep going forward. I really appreciate the progression in this game. It's definitely reminiscent of Resident Evil 4, and really if you play these games back to back, you'll see what I'm talking about. They are quite similar in that way, but I'm still going to give the edge to 4 in that progression. But I still think Village as a whole just won my heart for that year. It was everything I wanted, and there's nothing to forget about when it comes to the horror in this game particularly, because they went all out here in particular sections of the game. And if you're someone who either doesn't like bugs or doesn't like gruesome horror with bodies, bodily horror, I guess is how you would put it, this is something that 7 and 8 especially got really well done, so that will definitely creep you the hell out. And of course you have werewolves, vampires, all that stuff. You really have just the general package of a horror game set in Romania. It really just does the job well. Really, there was nothing else this year that got me interested in the slightest. I believe the Game of the Year winner was It Takes Two, and personally, I just never had someone to play it with, so I never really got into it or got the idea that I would like to play it at some point in the future. So personally, when that came out as Game of the Year, I didn't really care, because of course I didn't even know what the game was. So personally, for me, I think Village takes the cake for 2021, and it's not even close. It was really the only game in 2021 that took my interest by a landslide, and that's why a lot of videos you'll see I'll be using Resident Evil Village gameplay, or in Resident Evil videos I'll be talking about Village in a very positive light. Not to say that it doesn't have any negatives, there are certainly negatives to be had. I think that it's rather short. I really would have preferred if the game was a little bit longer. Even if it didn't have the DLC, I think I would have scrapped the DLC to have a longer main story. But even that aside, I think the game as a whole is just great to me. And whether or not you like the Ethan Winters story, there's no denying here that they absolutely excelled at wrapping it up. Even if he could have maybe had a third game, but that's just me. I think he could have gotten a third game. But with just 2 games, I think it does the story well, and it really wraps up with the Winter storyline, especially going into Requiem. I think it does just so much service that it absolutely deserves 2021's Game of the Year, at least by my standards, of course. Though It Takes Two might have been a more popular choice, so I can obviously understand that one. It's not as divisive as last year's 2020, so this is fine, I guess. But Village is going to be my Game of the Year by a landslide for 2021. Alright, 2022 Game of the Year. I think this one's fairly simple, but you're not actually going to be seeing Elden Ring gameplay, you're going to be seeing God of War Ragnarok gameplay, and here's why. So for the longest time since 2022, I was honestly going to say God of War Ragnarok deserved Game of the Year in that it got robbed. And, well, that was a very, very foolish mindset, but that's the mindset that I had for a long time once Ragnarok released, and initially I was very happy with the game, to the point where I've had it over Elden Ring. I played both games extensively, and I recently went back to complete the game earlier this year and last year. So that said, you might be asking why I had it here and why I have so much gameplay for Ragnarok and not Elden Ring. Well, here's why. Elden Ring, to me, proved that I can play different games from different genres and be very much happy with it, compared to just sticking with the usual action-adventure games that for a good while I was stuck to playing. God of War Ragnarok, I think, was the last time I played an action-adventure game and was kind of content with it, but it has aged so poorly for me that it went from Game of the Year for the longest time for me to being one of the worst games of the year. Yeah, for me, Ragnarok proved that playing it too safe, and playing it safe over and over with the story, with gameplay, with the whole game as a whole, before Valhalla anyway, playing it so safe, it's just not worth it. And unfortunately, this means that I have to put it here because I just simply do not like what the game has to offer, and instead went over to Elden Ring, where I can easily say without a doubt that for Game of the Year, I have Elden Ring, same as the actual nomination, and for good reason. It is a damn good game. I'm not a Souls guy, but I can tell you that this is a good game when I see it. Compared to this, right? I'm just gonna put several shots of gameplay here. This is not a game that I would like to be playing. This is not something I'm going to spend 3 hours on just to get to the next section with Kratos. This is why it lost Game of the Year for me, looking back. This is why I haven't gone back to play this game, specifically because they went out of their way to ruin the pacing. The pacing of God of War Ragnarok is some of the worst, easily some of the worst in any modern game that I've played in a very long time. It probably goes up there with The Last of Us 2 in terms of pacing, which you might start to actually see a theme here. Last of Us 2 and God of War Ragnarok, both sequels to fan favorite games, both of them complete disappointments in the story department. There's no reason why the story should be this slow and the pacing should be granted to this much of a halt when you're talking about the last game in the Norse mythology. This is going to be the last Norse game, and yet you have the audacity, you have the nerve to slow the pace to this much of a halt to explore characters that we're not even going to see until probably 5-6 years later because they're working on something else. I mean, at that point, what do you even... Look, this isn't supposed to be a Ragnarok rant, but I have to rant about it because I never got the chance to rant about it in 2022, so I'm going to do it here and instead give it to Elden Ring because Elden Ring absolutely deserves Game of the Year. And really, I think most people would agree with that one as well, but this is one of the few times where I'm actually going to agree with the audience consensus here because Elden Ring, I think, was just so much fun to play, and it was so different from what I played before at this point in my life that yeah, it deserves it. It completely deserves it. And Ragnarok, on the other hand, can... Honestly, I'm going to be kind of bluntly honest here. Ragnarok can go eat shit. It really was one of my least favorite games of all time now because of what it did for me regarding these kinds of games. Going forward, I'm going to be kind of careful playing more story games like this if it's just going to play it so damn safe, not take any risk, and really just be kind of bland and boring and really just slow the pacing down for no real reason. I do apologize that I went into a bit of a rant there, but that is my thoughts regarding Ragnarok and why Elden Ring absolutely deserved it. And obviously, Elden Ring speaks for itself, but I'll just list a few things here. It is visually beautiful, the gameplay is awesome, you can essentially go wherever you want without hand holding, and even that aside, I just absolutely love how the world is designed. You can travel essentially to where you want to go. You don't have to let the story dictate where you're going to go. And it works here, of course, because it's a Souls game, but also because it's so highly polished. It absolutely deserves, to me at least, to be the best game of 2022, and it's not even particularly close. It's definitely a new milestone for how big a gap can get between the game of the year, for me at least. So it absolutely deserves it, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to say it, it's quite uncontested in that regard for Game of the Year 2022. Alright, back into more positive territory with 2023. With this being an exceptional year for gaming, this was actually quite difficult, and for the most part, it was quite tight for me. Initially, I had Spider-Man 2, and a lot of you might know that I had Spider-Man 2 as one of my favorite games, not just of the year, but of all time. And I still think I stand by that, but for Game of the Year, it did not win for me. It ultimately, coming down to this video, has switched from Spider-Man 2 to Resident Evil 4 Remake. It's a bit odd, again, because it's a remake, but screw it. At this point, a remake should be allowed. It was an exceptional remake. It's one of my favorite games of all time, and it's an exceptional remake as a whole. With the original Resident Evil remake, if not better in some ways. I think that the action here, the story, how Ashley works here is so much better that really Resident Evil 4 Remake is a milestone for remakes, just as the original was all the way back in 2002. This really works out because it proves that they could still make remakes that are worth a damn. Sure, Resident Evil 3 Remake might not have been lived up to people's expectations, but I still think for the most part that they have nailed it with recreating these experiences in the modern era. It was so close for me here between this and Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 2 might have taken the edge for me in some ways. Playing as Venom was definitely on consideration, and Symbiote Rush, of course, was also in consideration. But I think just at the end of the day, I like the story of Resident Evil 4 a bit more here. And of course, I just love the gameplay, parrying, kicking with Leon. It's just so much fun that I had no choice but to unfortunately give it to Resident Evil 4 Remake. It was so close. And I still have the review video up for Spider-Man 2, and in that video, I was quite a bit more harsh with it, hence why I gave it about, I think, an 83 out of 100. So not exactly the greatest score out there. So that might seem a bit confusing on why I think it's so close. But that was just me being nitpicky, being as critical as I can be, compared with this game, where if I were to do a video on this game as a whole, as a remake, if I had to do a review on this one, I would probably be giving it somewhere around a 90 to a 95, closest I can to an 100, because of how complete it feels and how much service it does as a game. Really, there's very few flaws I could talk about, but I guess I will talk about it just to make it seem like it's not completely biased here, because again, it's very close between this and Spider-Man 2, but this just has the slight edge in many small ways that add up to being my game of the year for 2023. For one thing, certain chapters are just not as good as others. I definitely think that around the chapter 13 mark, it definitely feels like they're going way off the rails with how they're going to progress the story, especially regarding the island. I definitely think the island was poorly designed here, just as it was in the OG. It just feels ridiculous to slap on so many damn enemies at once that it feels almost like RE5 in that sense of just having turret sections and a shit ton of enemies coming at you. And yeah, sure, you could do stealth to help yourself through these sections, but then you have the Hunnigan helicopter, and really, I just feel like they added it in there just to be like, lol, we have this huge section where you can play with all your weaponry and just have a ton of fun. And it's fun for sure, but it's such a pain in the ass to go through, especially on hardcore and professional. It's just so much of a pain that really it's not even fun. It's just tedious, especially regarding how they have the enemies spawn and how there are traps practically everywhere that you could hardly navigate, because again, in the later chapters you're stuck on the island and there's enemies everywhere. It's just such a pain in the ass, and really one of the few things that I could deduct a point for is just because of how the latter stages really don't feel all that greatly designed. It definitely feels like they were just, yeah, let's slap an island together. Hell, it feels more like Resident Evil Outbreak than anything else. Let's just have that put here and boom, let's call it a day. So that's really only the few nitpicks I can really come up with. But other than that, honestly, it's a fucking great remake. I just absolutely love it to pieces, and it absolutely deserves my game of the year because it nails every expectation I had going into it and more. Absolutely love it, and the DLC certainly does it favors by being pretty fun. I don't think it's an incredible DLC, but it's still quite fun, and I still play it from time to time because playing as Ada in RE4 feels quite good, and especially the Mercenaries mode as well. That's also another thing I want to mention on here. The Mercenaries mode is incredible, even if the characters don't feel all that great. Louise, you know who I'm talking about. There are certain characters that play better than others, but it just feels like so much fun. It adds so much replay value to the total package that it just had to be added into consideration here and made RE4 the game of the year for 2023. At least for me, at least for Dark Ops, I think that it would be my game of the year. Though that is not to discredit Baldur's Gate 3, which actually won Game of the Year. Personally, I just never really got around to playing it, and I don't have much interest in it. A good friend of mine actually made a video talking about this. His name's I'm Tuxedo. You should go check him out. He made a video pretty similar to this, but personally for me, I think Resident Evil 4 Remake absolutely deserves Game of the Year for 2023. Followed very closely by Spider-Man 2. So it was quite close here, but at the end of the day, it's got to go to Resident Evil 4. Now, 2024, this is going to be quite a new entry for me as I've recently just completed this game as well, so my thoughts on it are fresh, and my story and the gameplay are all fresh in my mind. It's gotta go to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. This is really funny because for the longest time, I didn't really have a game of the year for 2024. I personally never played a whole lot of games that came out that year that I could decisively say, yeah, it deserves game of the year. The winner being Astrobot was certainly quite comical, and honestly, I was having it pinned on Wukong, but neither game winning and instead going to Astrobot is quite humorous. I think now looking back that it absolutely should have gone to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Now, what I will say though is that this is going to be a very, very weird selection because of what I'm about to talk about and what I will talk about in my eventual review of this game. The story here is absolutely contingent on part 3 because this serves as a bridge between the old games and of course remake and part 3 and the new ending. If the story does not go according to plan, if part 3 fumbles, then this will fumble the game as well. A lot of this game is setting up for the finale. So really, it just comes down to, do you like this game as a whole, and do you think it will be good leading up into part 3? And do you think part 3 retroactively could ruin it? And while of course not, because right, this game is very polished and the gameplay is excellent, the graphics are beautiful, and really there's nothing much to complain about here as a whole, this remains very contingent on whether or not it follows up with its story premise. Because a lot of the story premise here, which is something I care about deeply with these games, especially with a story this complex and this good and characters this well done, it highly remains contended for me on part 3. So unfortunately, this is going to be very weird, because while I think it absolutely deserved Game of the Year, I don't blame people for not giving it that, because at the end, it does feel like a bit of a cliffhanger. And I definitely think that the way they're going about the story can definitely be seen as poor storytelling to some, even though, again, I feel like this is something Kojima would do, and if Kojima did it, then people would be fucking up in arms, and they'd be happy about it, but, this is not Kojima. This is just a Final Fantasy VII story, and really one that I think could be nailed perfectly. If Part 3 is nailed, this is an easy, uncontested 2024 pick for me. However, if the story flops, if Part 3 ends up being bad, if the story retroactively ruins this one, then it's kind of, yeah, I have no pick for 2024. But as is right now, as of the making this video, to me, it's not contested. It's Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. It's one of my favorite games of all time currently, for good reason. Gameplay, story, side quests that are significantly better than that of Remake. It is an improvement objectively in every single way. At least I would think so. I'm not going to use the word objectively, but to me personally, I think it's an improvement on Remake in every single way that matters, while simultaneously having more bosses, while simultaneously letting us see more Sephiroth. It is an improvement in every way, and it absolutely deserved it. Music, I believe it also won in 2024 for Best Soundtrack. Absolutely deserved it. The soundtrack here is incredible. No Promises to Keep, one of my favorite gaming songs of all time. That got me to tears. If we want to talk about more of this, we're going to talk about it in the review. But this game nails it in every single aspect. It's just a story that will remain contingent with Part 3. If Part 3 nails it, then this will be an easy winner. But of course, if it doesn't, then that means all the setup here, all the build-up, all the characters would have been for nothing. So this is very, very contingent. But for right now, there is no contest for me. 2024 goes to Rebirth. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth by a landslide. It is not even close. This will probably be the biggest one so far because of just how well it does in every single remark, while also having some of the best performances I've seen. Honestly, Expedition 33 is the only thing that comes close for me for performances. It just does so well here. I just have to give it to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth for Game of the Year 2024. Alright, 2025, we are finally here at the end. This one should be fairly simple considering how many videos I've made on the game and how much I've sung its praises. 2025's Game of the Year is quite obvious, and it also won by the popular vote, and it also won by the actual nomination.
And the Game of the Year is... Mon ami Clair Obscur, Expedition 33!
It is absolutely phenomenal. There's really not much I can say about it that I either already haven't said or the internet already hasn't said. So let's just quickly go through it, because this game to me resembles some of the finest work that an indie studio can do. Now, yes, it is a bit weird to call it indie because it is being published by someone. However, the studio being just, 33 people and having a budget of less than 10 million, and even budget aside, it's still a small part-time team. It's not a team that makes AAA games out there. Considering the team that made this and how incredible it is, and the fact that it got so many people into turn-based games, not saying that it's the best turn-based game out there. I don't really need to hear that argument again, all the arguments regarding this game. It just does everything so well and polished to the highest degree that it has to win Game of the Year, I think. It does almost no sins, really. It's not just me saying that this game is perfect, but I can't think of any real sins here that I think would drag it down to not be Game of the Year. It has a price tag that's reasonable, $50 for the first game, and it absolutely deserves all that content. We got free DLC, you have endgame content, you have so much story to explore in just this world. The performances are some of the best, like I said, in 2024. I think for 2025, this is going to be Expedition 33's one of the biggest strengths for this game is the performances. Everyone here just does an excellent job. And Ben Starr especially is just so excellent as Verso. The characters here, they all feel diverse, but they don't feel forced. They feel like they really have their own personalities. The story here feels complex, yet feels relatively simple at the same time because of how self-contained it can be. Just there's so much here in this game alone that I think it warrants every price tag. It absolutely warrants being Game of the Year. Music of the Year, absolutely. It has some of the best music in any game, period. I'll just say that right now. I thought Rebirth has some of the best music in this game too. I think they're both tied for me for having some of the best soundtracks in any video game. They both put all of their effort into it, and this game especially just puts it into all the bosses and all the areas, and just really, it feels so complete to me. Expedition 33 resembles a game that I would define as close to perfect value as you can get. Not to describe it as a perfect game, I would give it a 10 out of 10, but that's not to say it's a perfect game. It has its flaws for sure, but ultimately, I think as a whole game, just as itself, as Clear Obscure Expedition 33, it absolutely nailed what it set out to do back when it was announced in 2024. A game that me and my friends, when we watched the trailer, weren't all that impressed. We were just, okay, it looks kind of cool. Might actually be a decent game in 2025. Boy, were we wrong when this game came out, because this just blew all my expectations out of the water, and it does everything to the highest level polish possible. So, Clear Obscure Expedition 33, my second time saying it, it deserves Game of the Year for 2025. And I hope that most of you will give it at least a chance, even if it's not your style of game, because it does appeal to a little bit of everyone. But I could totally understand just not getting into it, parrying, dodging, all that stuff. I could totally understand, but for the most part, I think it's uncontested for me for 2025. It could have been contested close had Doom the Dark Ages been actually pretty good. But unfortunately for me, Doom was just not all that great. It was actually quite a letdown in 2025. I honestly wanted Doom to be better than what we got. Doom Eternal was something I wanted to mention earlier, but I just didn't have time to. Doom the Dark Ages is much worse than Eternal, personally, and unfortunately is quite a bit of a letdown. So it really just comes down to Clair Obscure Expedition 33 as Game of the Year for 2025. For me personally, as Dark Ops, I think it absolutely deserves it as Game of the Year. That's going to be all from me, though. I know this was a bit of a longer video. I do want to get more videos out, especially with all the support you guys have given me recently. I just want to thank all of you also if you made it this far into the video. We recently just surpassed 800 subscribers, so I do want to thank all of you so much for the support. And really, there's nowhere I'd rather be than just making content for you guys. So I appreciate all the support, and I thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed, please hit that like button and subscribe. I could always use a new addition to the Dark Ops army. And if you enjoyed this video as well, let me know in the comments below which ones you agreed with. What was your Game of the Year for the last 5 years? Let me know in the comments below. But thank you guys so much for watching. This is Dark Ops. I'll see you guys next time.